My best friend shoved a weird note under my door one morning. That was how the nightmare began. Sunlight was painting stripes on my bedroom floor when I woke up Saturday morning. Super weird, because sleeping in was kinda my thing on Saturdays. But today was different. Something had nudged me awake, something like a little alarm bell ringing in the back of my head. It wasn't a bad dream, just a restless, uneasy feeling, like knowing you forgot to study for a big test. Instead of burrowing back under the covers, I dragged myself out of bed. Sugary cereal was calling my name. Hey, it was Saturday, the day for guilt-free cartoons and bowls of pure sugar-coated goodness. But as I stumbled out of my room and towards the stairs, a splash of yellow caught my eye. Right by the front door, lying on the floor like someone had dropped it, was a bright yellow sticky note. And it was glowing. Okay, maybe not actually glowing, but with the sunlight hitting it just right, it sure looked like it. I knew, even before bending down to pick it up, that it was from Toby. Me and Toby, we'd been best friends practically since we were in diapers. I'm talking building forts in the woods, sharing comic books, riding bikes with no hands kind of best friends. We did everything together, and part of that, everything, was knowing each other's handwriting, even if it was messy. And Toby's handwriting? Definitely messy. Like a spider dipped its feet in ink and went for a walk across the page kind of messy. Picking up the note, my stomach did a little flip-flop, and not the good kind. It wasn't just the messy handwriting. It was the words scrawled across the page. Jamie, come to the old sawmill as soon as you get this. It's urgent. Toby, urgent? Now, this was officially weird. See, Toby wasn't much of a note writer. Normally, if he wanted my attention, which, let's be honest, was pretty much every day, he'd just chuck pebbles at my window. Then I'd pull open my curtains, and there he'd be, grinning like a goofball, hair sticking up every which way, looking for all the world like he had a secret to tell. But a note? And urgent? That just screamed, something's wrong. The rest of the house was quiet. My parents, who worked their tails off all week, were sound asleep. Saturday mornings were sacred in our house, the one morning you could sleep in without mom's legendary pancake breakfast wake-up call. Which meant me sneaking out was a big fat no-no. But Toby wouldn't use the "you" word unless it was super important, right? Swallowing down my nerves, which I decided to have a party in my stomach, I skipped my usual Saturday morning cartoon marathon. A real sacrifice, trust me, and got dressed faster than a cheetah on a caffeine rush. Just in case this was some kind of emergency, I shoved my phone in my pocket. Who knows, maybe Toby needed a ride or something. As I crept through the house, careful not to wake the parental units, my brain went into overdrive, replaying every conversation, every weird look, every single thing Toby and I had done together in the last, like, forever, trying to figure out what could possibly be so urgent. Sneaking out was like a carefully choreographed dance. I eased the front door open so slowly it was practically poetic, wincing at every creak of the hinges. Stepping outside, the crisp morning air was like a slap in the face. The birds were doing their best rock concert impression, and the sun was already climbing in the sky, determined to turn the day into a scorcher. But none of that registered. Because across the street, parked in Toby's driveway, alongside his dad's ancient pickup truck, the one that sounded like a herd of angry rhinoceroses when you started it, was a police car. A police car, right there in Toby's driveway. Talk about sending my imagination into a tailspin. Well, now, Jamie, you're up brighter and earlier than a rooster this morning. I practically jumped out of my skin and spun around so fast I'm surprised I didn't leave my sneakers glued to the sidewalk. There, leaning against the fence separating our yards, stood Mr. Willows, looking as dapper as ever in his signature suit and tie. Mr. Willows was our next-door neighbor, and let me tell you, the man never met a suit he didn't like. It didn't matter if he was weeding his prized rose bushes or taking out the trash. Mr. Willows always looked like he was headed to some fancy meeting with the mayor or something. It was kinda his thing. "Morning, Mr. Willows," I managed to squeak out, hoping he hadn't noticed me practically jumping out of my skin. "Just, enjoying the fresh air. A fine morning for a stroll, it is," Mr. Willows agreed, nodding his head slowly. He took a long, slow drag from his ever-present cigarette and squinted at me through the smoke, those cloudy blue eyes taking in every detail. Now, I'm not usually one to gossip, but that police car over at Toby's had me seriously spooked. But something told me that chatting about it with Mr. Willows, the dude who always seemed to know everyone's business but never shared his own, wasn't going to be productive. So, I kept my mouth shut, my internal freak-out alarm getting louder by the second. "Haven't happened to see your pal Toby this fine morning, have you?" Mr. Willows asked, his gaze still lingering on me a beat too long. It felt kinda knowing, like he was fishing for information. Or, weirder yet, like he already knew something I didn't. "Nope, haven't seen him," I lied, stuffing my hands deep in my pockets, wishing I could disappear into thin air. We were supposed to meet up later, though. He left me a note. You know how it is, teenagers and their important plans. I babbled, hating the way my voice sounded. High-pitched and way too eager to please. Mr. Willows took another drag from his cigarette, a small plume of smoke curling into the still morning air. A note, you say? He mused, raising his eyebrows. That's certainly old school, wouldn't you say? Most young lads these days, they're all about those texting contraptions. Yeah, Toby's not exactly up on the latest tech, I said, my voice strained. I desperately wanted to pry, to blurt out, hey, you see that cop car across the street? You know what's up with that? But something about Mr. Willows, maybe the way he watched me with those sharp blue eyes, kept me from saying anything. It was like he had secrets he wasn't sharing. Well, enjoy your morning stroll, Jamie, Mr. Willows finally said, those eyes twinkling with something I couldn't decipher. And you be sure to give young Toby my regards. Will do, Mr. Willows, I mumbled, then practically ran away before he could say anything else. My sneakers pounded against the pavement, but they couldn't outrun the image of that police car, the sick, heavy feeling that had settled in my stomach. Toby wouldn't say something was urgent unless it really was urgent. And the fact that the cops were involved? That didn't exactly spell, everything's fine. I cut through Mrs. Peterson's yard, dodging her prize-winning rose bushes, and her wrath. I knew she'd be out here soon, tending to her beloved plants like they were royalty. She'd given me an earful or two in the past about trampling her flower beds, and today wasn't the day to tempt fate. I veered towards the patch of woods behind our street. There was a trail there, barely visible, that led to the old abandoned sawmill at the edge of town. It was a creepy place, even in broad daylight, the kind of place that whispered and groaned in the wind, the windows like watchful eyes. My mind went back to the note, the urgent, burning itself into my thoughts. It all seemed to point to the sawmill, that place that had given me nightmares as a kid. See, me and Toby, we were practically fearless back then. We dared each other to do all sorts of crazy stuff, climbing the highest trees, riding our bikes down the steepest hills. But the sawmill was different. It had this vibe, you know? A kind of silence that felt heavier than normal, like something was watching you from the shadows. We hadn't been there in years, not since the day Toby swore he'd seen something moving in the shadows on the top floor, a glimpse of something he couldn't quite make out. It had freaked us both out so badly we swore never to go back. It became our unspoken rule, the sawmill was off limits. So why would Toby want to meet me there now? And what on earth was so darn urgent? The woods were cool and shadowy, even with the sunlight trying its best to peek through the dense canopy of leaves. The trail was overgrown, thorny bushes reaching out to snag my clothes. My breath felt short and shallow, like I'd just run a marathon. Every creak of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth sent shivers racing down my spine. I was jumpier than a squirrel on a sugar rush, that's for sure. The sawmill, when it finally came into view through the trees, looked even creepier than I remembered. It was this hulking, gray mass of wood and crumbling brick, windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. The fence surrounding it had long since succumbed to rust and age, some of the wooden slats completely rotted through. The gate hung open at a crazy angle, like some giant hand had ripped it off its hinges. Despite the warmth of the morning, a shiver danced down my spine. A voice inside my head, small but persistent, whispered, "Turn back. Go home, nothing good can come from this." But another voice, stronger and more familiar, drowned it out. It was the voice of friendship, of loyalty. Toby needed me. He wouldn't have used that word, urgent, unless something was seriously wrong. So, ignoring the voice screaming at me to run in the opposite direction, I ducked under the broken fence and stepped onto the overgrown property. The air, even with the warm sunlight filtering through the trees, felt instantly colder, heavier, like a wet blanket had been draped over my shoulders. A flock of crows took flight from the branches of a nearby tree, cawing angrily, their harsh cries echoing through the eerie silence. Even the birds sounded spooked. The closer I got, the more my apprehension morphed into full-blown terror. My pace slowed to a crawl, each step accompanied by the sound of my own heartbeat drumming in my ears. "Toby?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy, even to my own ears. "It's Jamie. You hear?" The only reply was a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the pounding in my chest. I moved towards the main entrance, drawn as much by fear as by curiosity. The double doors, once imposing barriers against the elements, hung precariously from their frames, half-rotted and weather-beaten, like they'd been through 100 storms and barely survived. "Toby, this isn't funny." I called out again, my voice cracking a little. I sounded like a kid lost in a department store, but I couldn't bring myself to shut up. Something about all that silence, the way it pressed down on me, amplified every instinct urging me to break it, fill the emptiness with, well, anything really. Pulling at what was left of a handle that had long since rusted shut, I managed to wrench one of the doors open far enough to squeeze inside. The interior was dim, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the cracks in the walls and roof, illuminating dust motes that swirled and danced in the air. Like miniature, ghostly ballerinas. The floor was a mess, chunks of concrete, broken planks of wood, rusted machine parts that looked like they'd been there since the dawn of time, all coated in a thick layer of grime and dust. Every inch of the place screamed, get out now, but I pressed on. Toby, seriously, dude, where are you? The silence was my only answer, heavy and expectant, as if the building itself were holding its breath. I'd made it about halfway across the expansive floor of the sawmill, my shoes crunching on who knows what, and desperately hoping it wasn't what I thought it might be. I was just about to give up, to scream, "This is a stupid idea, I'm outta here," when I spotted it. On the floor, propped up against the bottom rung of a set of rickety stairs that looked like they hadn't been used in a century, was a splash of color in the otherwise dull, decaying landscape of the sawmill's interior. A bright, almost unnatural, splash of color. Mr. Willow's tie. It wasn't the fact that it was just there, lying on the ground, that made my blood run cold. It was what was on it. It was covered in dark, brownish-red splotches that could only be one thing. Blood. My stomach, already doing its best impression of a bouncy castle, lurched, and a wave of nausea washed over me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood at attention. There's a primal part of your brain that just knows, without a doubt, when something is deeply, terribly, wrong. And that part of my brain was blaring a siren so loud it practically deafened me. My eyes darted to the shadows, to the maze of rusty machinery and broken-down workbenches, half expecting Mr. Willows to jump out, brandishing a rusty chainsaw or some other terrifying weapon. But there was no movement, no sound except for the panicked thudding of my own heart and the increasingly frantic whispers of, "Get out. Get out now," echoing in my head. Then I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible above the pounding of my pulse, coming from somewhere above me. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the wooden floorboards on the floor above. Panic, pure and icy cold, gripped me like a vice. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to turn and run, to get out of that creepy, death trap of a building. But where was Toby? He had to be here somewhere. I couldn't leave without knowing what happened. It was Toby, my best friend, the dude who'd always had my back, the dude who I'd do anything for. Taking a deep breath that did absolutely nothing to calm my nerves, I slowly, reluctantly, made my way to the base of the creaking, groaning staircase. My brain screamed, this is a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad idea. But my feet, as if possessed by some force outside my control, kept moving, drawn up those stairs by a potent cocktail of fear, loyalty, and morbid curiosity. Each step creaked and groaned beneath my weight, the sound echoing through the vast, empty space of the sawmill like the moans of some restless spirit. The air grew mustier, thicker, the metallic tang of blood stronger the higher I climbed. My eyes darted back and forth, trying to penetrate the gloom. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, playing tricks on my overactive imagination. "Toby, are you up there?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The word hung in the heavy air, unanswered. But that dragging, thudding sound, it continued. Closer now. I reached the top of the stairs, my legs shaking so badly I thought they might give way. Ahead of me lay a long, dark hallway. Cobwebs, thick as cotton candy, hung from every beam and rafter. It felt colder up here, the air thick with a strange, almost sweet scent that I couldn't quite place. My head was starting to ache, and I desperately wished I had listened to that little voice in my head that had told me to turn back, to call the cops. Sucking in a fortifying breath that did little to quell the rising tide of panic, I inched down the hallway, one slow, hesitant step at a time. "Toby, come on, dude. This isn't funny anymore." Only silence greeted my pleas, thick, heavy silence punctuated by the rhythmic thump drag that was drawing closer. I was nearing the end of the hallway now. Moonlight streamed through a large, gaping hole in the wall where a window used to be, casting the space ahead in an eerie, otherworldly glow. The hallway opened into a large room, and that's where I saw him. Toby. He was standing in the middle of the room, his back to me. He was frozen in place, as if someone had hit the pause button on a movie, shoulders slumped, head down, his entire body completely still except for a slight tremor that ran through him every few seconds. Like he was shivering. Toby. Relief, so powerful it almost took my breath away, flooded through me, chasing away some, but not all, of the fear that had taken root in my gut. My best friend was alive. Whatever had happened to Mr. Willows, Toby was still okay. I rushed towards him, every muscle screaming at me to get closer, to make sure, really sure, he was all right. Dude, what the heck, man? You scared the living daylights out of me. I reached out to clap him on the back, but he turned and stopped dead in my tracks. His face. I don't even have the words. His eyes, those usually bright, mischievous eyes, were vacant and wide, staring straight ahead as if he didn't even see me. And his face was covered in blood. Blood matted in his hair, streaked down his cheeks, crusted around his mouth. It was like something out of one of those horror movies I wasn't supposed to watch. And that's when I saw what was in his hand. It was an axe, an old-fashioned axe, with a wooden handle worn smooth with time and a blade that glinted in the pale moonlight. And it was covered, from handle to blade, in blood. My legs, no longer capable of holding my weight, buckled. I stumbled back, crashing into the wall, my scream lost in the vastness of the sawmill, swallowed by the shadows and the dust. Mr. Willow's axe. I recognized it, even through the blood. It was the same axe he used to trim those precious rose bushes of his. The axe was moving now, slowly at first, then gaining speed as it arced through the air. It was coming right at me, and all I could think was, I'm too young to die. This can't be happening. Then everything went black. When I woke up, it took me a moment to realize I was in my own bed, my mom hovering over me, her face a mask of worry. Honey, thank goodness you're alright. We found you passed out in the woods. What on earth were you doing at that dreadful sawmill? And where's Toby? He wasn't with you. I tried to speak, to tell her about the note, the blood, the axe. But the words wouldn't come out. My throat felt raw and scratched, and my head pounded like a drum solo. I spent the next few days in a blur of doctor's visits and police questioning. My parents, my friends, everyone wanted to know what had happened, where Toby was. But how could I explain something that made no sense, not even to me? They never found Toby. They searched for weeks, those forests and fields beyond the town, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. Just like Mr. Willow's. No explanation, no closure. Just this gaping hole where my best friend used to be. The cops called it a runaway case. They figured Toby had done something to Mr. Willow's. Maybe he'd found him dead at the sawmill. Maybe something had happened accidentally, and in a panic, Toby had taken off. They never found a body, no sign of Mr. Willow's, which made their theory even harder to swallow. But I knew in my gut, in the deepest part of me, that something else had happened that day in that godforsaken sawmill. Something I couldn't begin to understand. They say time heals all wounds, but those wounds, those scars, run deep. Sometimes, I can almost pretend everything's normal. But then, I'll catch a flash of movement from the corner of my eye, or I'll smell a familiar whiff of Mr. Willow's pipe tobacco on the breeze, and the memories come rushing back, vivid and terrifying. The note, the blood, Toby's vacant eyes. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls and the trees outside my window creak and groan, I swear I hear him whispering my name. And the sawmill at the edge of town? Well, let's just say it's still standing. A silent, brooding reminder that some secrets are better left buried.